wants everyone. And then now the problem is that God hasn't necessarily said that to you specifically. And then now you are doing this, then the next thing you are homeless, and then you are blaming God for being homeless when He never at all instructed you to do that.
He didn't say so to Zacchaeus.
Exactly.
And others.
Yes. Okay. So I think that makes sense. Then the next one, balance versus extremism. Again, I think we touched a little bit on this in the morning. There are effectively two extremes that we can say, just to maybe reiterate and go a bit deeper. There are people who really hold the spirit of prophecy to high regard. I would say perhaps in some cases, there's a hand there, noted, thank you. I would say to some extent to fanatic levels. Sometimes you will come across, for example, a brother or even a sister who they almost exclusively read the spirit of prophecy more than they read the Bible. Such that even if you are asking a question, they are ready to give you a quotation, but they will not readily give you a Bible verse for that. So that is the one extreme. Then the other extreme, of course, there are those of us who we do not want to hear the spirit of prophecy. In fact, I've heard stories of, I cannot validate this because fortunately, I will say I haven't personally experienced it. I've heard stories of people being told, you're invited in the church somewhere, and then you are told that, listen, dear brother, here in this church, we don't stick to the Bible, we don't want to hear about spirit of prophecy. So there are those extremes whereby people effectively, they almost despise the writings of Ellen White, if I can put it that way. We find both these extremes in our church. How would you caution towards occupying a balanced sort of like disposition towards Ellen White and her writings in the context of these two extremes, if that makes sense?
Thank you. I think one aspect we need to recognize about Ellen White is that her writings have what is called some of her statements are stating the ideal, the ideal that we must all be aiming for. While some of her statements also recognize the reality, the reality that the circumstances may not even favor, operating at the ideal level. And so you have statements like where he says, I don't have the right words, but talking about prayer, that the best, the best, that's the way she uses, I can't remember, where she's talking about that the most appropriate position in prayer is in kneeling, when you're kneeling. And so for some, they take it that, there is no prayer that should be offered without kneeling. Yes. They have set food on the table, they want to pray for the food, they all kneel around the table, And so you find that even in church, every time you say, let's pray, they kneel, because they are focused on that statement. But if you read widely, in Ellen White's writings, you discover that she sometimes talks about her personal experience, that she prayed long in the night, while in bed. While in bed, she could not sleep. Something was weighing on her mind. In Australia, when she was in Australia, she was going to preach, but because she was suffering from rheumatism and arthritis, she said, I could not kneel with the brethren. While everyone else knelt, she could not kneel, and so she remained seated while the prayer was given. And she says, I believe that God, heard our prayer. because she was given, strength to deliver the message. Yeah, she longed to have knelt down, but the circumstances did not allow. Yeah, so she recognizes the ideal, but also she's aware of the real, the real situation. Yeah, so that is where, and to that actually to be able to differentiate between the two, she sometimes advises that let's use good common sense. Let's use good common sense. Yeah, but sometimes we lack that common sense, and so we want to stick to the ideal. And that goes also even in practicing vegetarianism. Some would want to stick to the strongest statement. But then when circumstances don't favor that, they don't allow that, you are just killing yourself. And she says people who take statements to that extent end up practicing or changing health reform to become health deformed. Yeah. So that's the problem of pulling it to the extreme.
And then also how do you ensure to guard from the other extreme of being disillusioned or rather find yourself for whatever reason despising your yes.
I think that's another extreme, and I think it becomes a reaction from one extreme to the other.
Yes.
Which also is not good, which also is not good. Maybe I can use a biblical example, about keeping the Sabbath. In the Old Testament, I think it's in the book of Exodus where we are even told not to light a fire on the Sabbath. Yeah. And so in the New Testament, you have the Pharisees. You have the Pharisees who have gone to another extreme, who want to maintain that. And then when they see Jesus healing on the Sabbath, they have doubts about Jesus, about his claims. And then they also speak to the people that there are 6 days in which you can come and get your healing. Why do you come on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, well, if your donkey or cow falls in a well on the Sabbath, would you not take it out? So why would it be wrong for a child of God, a daughter of God, to receive healing when Satan has been, mistreating treating her for 18 years, in that case? So again, that's where common sense fails, common sense fails. And Jesus says it is good to do good on the Sabbath. We are not to work on the Sabbath, but there is some good that we can do on the Sabbath, which is in agreement with God's merciful, acts to humanity. Yeah.
So before I give the elder there in the back, could we then say, Promise, that the best remedy, perhaps, or especially when for those of us maybe who are disillusioned or who find ourselves despising the spirit of prophecy, because we were bombarded with it by people who were using it as a hammer, would then the remedy really for it be for you to actually go and study it for yourself? Would that perhaps be considered as the best remedy against you having a negative spirit towards the spirit of prophecy because of others?
I believe that would be the best thing to do, because we often want to do what we have heard or what other people have, say to us, or we want to avoid what other people are doing, or not doing. But if we read the writings of Ellen White ourselves, we'll be able to get the benefit. We'll be able to see how balanced she was. Because there are some who say Ellen White struggled to become a vegetarian. But Ellen White was not a fanatic who would say, from today I will never, I will never eat meat, And yet, as Adventists, I think our cutting point is Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, clean between clean and unclean, foods or meats. But we know that becoming a vegetarian is a healthier choice than just eating, meat because it's clean. Yes, you can eat, but the healthier choice may be you moving towards the vegetarianism. And also, Ellen White was conscious of the fact that places are not the same. There are some food stuff you can find in one place which you can't find in another place. So she was not fanatical in the sense that she said, I vowed that I will never. That was not her approach. Her approach was one of following, doing what is best under the circumstances. Doing what is best under the circumstances. And so, by reading her writings, we can be able to see the balance in her writing. Yeah, but by listening to people, we may listen to one who is tuned to the highest note. So that may hurt us.
Yes.
Yeah, and we may swing into another extreme where we
none of that.
Yeah, we throw out everything.
Yeah. So the moral of the story is that read for yourself before you make a decision concerning the writings of Ellen White. Same thing we say about the Bible. Read for yourself. Dalon.
Because I want to ask you this because it seems like this prophet or the message, I'm way back to context, seems to be progressive. Because the messages she writes in 1845, when you read them after 1861, you may feel that she was contradicting herself if you don't pay attention. Say, where she writes that pork, you can slaughter the fat one for Christmas. And then, after 1861, she says, hey, no pork. No pork. It seems a prophet or a messenger is progressive. When she writes before 1870, she writes something about faith, righteousness by faith. But in 1890, this message seems to be sharp. And if her husband would have listened at that moment, she would say, no, this is not the Adventist message that we used to preach, because it is different from what she believed before the 18th century. That's my question is this messenger, in terms of context, understand this messenger? Must we read in a progression and understand in the eras or times she lived and understand the message for simplicity?
Thank you very much. What you said is very correct. There is a progression in terms of understanding. There's a growth in understanding because a prophet doesn't know everything. They speak and share what God has revealed to them at that time. And so the more revelations they receive, the more their understanding also increases. Now, the prophets also are impacted by the messages that they receive. In 1858, Stephen Haskell, one of the pioneers, Stephen Haskell, wrote about eating pork, quoting from the Bible. Ellen White advised him to hold those views to himself, until God has shown his people the way to go. And when you come to 1863, when she had a major health vision, one of the instructions or one of the things she understood was, on the issue of eating, pork or swine flesh. And that vision also made her to change her position on the issue of eating swine's flesh. So we could add another example. Post the Millerite disappointment, there was a group of former Millerites who believed that probation had been closed. It was called a shut door, policy or doctrine. And Ellen White was part of that. But later on, she changed her position when she understood better. So prophets do not know everything. They are not pace setters in terms of knowing everything. They also change positions. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that what you said, something, and what she claimed to have, what she said that God has shown her, and then she said something else that God has shown me against what he. No, there is no inconsistency with what God reveals. But in terms of human understanding as prophets, they change positions in towards broader understanding, towards better understanding. I think we can put this against Paul. He was the persecutor of the church. But when he met Christ, he changed, and started now speaking on the side of Christ and so on. So there is growth in understanding. There is also fine-tuning in terms of their writings. Yeah, there is maturing of their writings, their understanding. We cannot say no to that.
In fact, actually, I think another example that speaks directly to this in the Bible. If you remember the story of, I believe it was the prophet Nathan, if I'm not mistaken. Is it Nathan?
Yes.
I hope that's the name.
It's Nathan. Yes.
David comes to him saying, "Hey, I have an idea. I'd like to build a temple for God." And then the prophet says, "Oh yeah, sure, go for it. Wonderful idea." The prophet was speaking from his personal capacity, but then soon God comes and corrects him and says that no, not David. He has too much blood on his hand. And then the prophet had to go back and correct the message that he had given to David. So in other words, we even, in the context of the Bible, have an example of a prophet taking one position because, from his own thinking, you want to build a temple for God, that sounds like a wonderful idea. It's a noble cause. But then God, through a vision, interjects and says, not quite. And then he has to change his example. So I think that then shows that even when it comes to prophets, as our Phyllis said, there is room for them to be corrected by God. And God often, sooner or later, ensures that he corrects them. And a true prophet will come and say, you know what, actually, I was mistaken when I said what I said earlier on. Yes.
If I can add, Ellen White also, the church had what was called the Southern Publishing Association. They had a printing house in Tennessee. And it was not making profit, but it was serving the southern states where there were many blacks. And so in consultation with the General Conference President, A.G. Daniels, she consented because he was saying that it's better to close it. So she said, yeah, you can go ahead and close it. But after she left, when the Lord again appeared to her, she wrote a letter to him and said, no, the Lord has cancelled against, what we had agreed. So prophets are subject to their own messages, the messages that they receive from the Lord. So we cannot say that you are inconsistent, because God corrects what if a prophet communicates that which was not God's will.
Yes.
The Lord himself will send the same prophet and say, can you correct that? And it just reveals the humanity of prophets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen. I love that. Can we help with the mic?
I think what I wanted to ask was, how do we now, in this day and age, how do we use, or how do we help young people to understand context, number one, and number two, how do we help them to not vilify development? Because at the moment, we're at a point where anyone from 1990 and upwards is really totally against it and right, and having reasons for it, of course. And with everything economically and politically that's happening in the world, everyone has picked a side, basically. And obviously, with what you pointed out in terms of what you said about racism and all those things, but how do we now, in our churches, daily or every Sabbath, how do we make Ellen White presentable in a way that does not make her seem like our God? Number one, because that's one of the things that come up, that we use Ellen White so much that we think she's our God. So how do we implement the study of Ellen White readings, the writings, and everything without what they would call brainwashing, without the reading out of context? And how do we make it interesting enough for them to want to read Ellen White writings right now? Because that's our biggest problem at the moment, where young people are like, oh no, I cannot. I absolutely will not touch the books. She's outdated. She speaks on things that are just not relevant to us right now. So how do we open their minds enough to understand the basics of, yes, that part might not be relevant, but this is, and that sort of thing. And I'm speaking on several books that she's written to young people, that young people don't even touch anymore, you know what I mean? So it's just, how do we do that now? How do we make Ellen White presentable, and how do we make her something that they'll be interested in reading? How do we make it interesting for them?
Thank you very much. I think what makes people to resent Ellen White is how we use her writings. When we want to correct whatever we think is wrong, we cite Ellen White. Ellen White begins to appear to them that she is standing in their way, standing in their way. Whatever they want to do, Ellen White is in the way. So they end up resenting what, her writings. Back in the 80s, there was a book called the Adventist Hot Potatoes. Adventist Hot Potatoes. And, again, the writer tells the story of a new convert, a young lady who joined Adventism. She was very happy. Now there was an announcement that there will be a potluck at church. And it's coming Sabbath. Please bring food. She comes and she has prepared this dish, with chicken and so on. And someone, when they opened this, said, who brought this? Ellen White. So she covered and, went away with her dish. And the next time she comes around, she said, okay, macaroni dish and so. But she put cheese. So again, when they opened it, Ellen White, and then she went for good, because she felt that, this religion is not compatible with me. I cannot do anything right. I cannot do anything right. So, again, it's abuse of Ellen White writings, where Ellen White becomes now the basis of judging people's behavior. We have put the Bible aside. We don't draw principles from the Bible and be able to speak also kindly and also become mentors, But now we want to use it almost like a stick, discipline a stick, So when we use the writings of Ellen White that way, it becomes a problem. Anyone can resent Ellen White. Always hearing Ellen White recited, against your behavior or what you are saying. How can we present it in an appealing way? I would throw the question back to the audience, but I think if we model the principles that Ellen White teaches or shares in her writings, we model in our own life. And again, it goes back to what we were saying in the morning about the fruit, the fruit of your message. How does Ellen White's writings impact your life? Do they make your life to be lovable and to be a loving Christian? She speaks about an Adventist home, that an Adventist home should be a loving and lovable, a Christian home. But do they impact our lives? Have we become loving and lovable? Or we just use them as a stick for hammering others, when we are not in line ourselves, when we don't practice and yet we want others to practice it, this, then it becomes a problem. So we need to model what she teaches and not use it against the others or against anyone. She used to become furious and say, I don't want anyone to be using my writings in Sister White says, go to the Bible. And so,
Yes.
Joe wants to.
Before I give you this, I just wanted to
add, yeah.
To add, yes, before I give you for this also, I want to also just throw this spanner in the works. Is that how it's said? As young people, then, we must also be honest enough to admit that, when we're speaking about the writings of Ellen White, or the Bible generally speaking, we are speaking about spiritual food. As young people at times, we lack an appetite because we are not spiritual. Can we be honest enough to admit that? If you're not spiritual, currently that I have a closet of sins that are chopping down my spirituality. And as a result, even during prayer, I get agitated. I feel like the prayer must quickly finish. You know this when it's happening to you. Not just young people, by the way, even old people for that matter. So I think in as much as there is the element of us not having an appetite for the writings of Ellen White because of the way in which people represent them in a bad way, let's also admit to ourselves that there may also be an element that causes us to not have an appetite because of our own spiritual condition. Can you say that's fair? Anyways, I leave that with you. Please. If we can pass the mic over here.
Thank you. No, I was going to say, on this note, like I think I understood the question of my sister on a deeper note, because she's not asking us how do we humanize Ellen White. She's asking how do we make her relevant, and also how do we rebrand her as a person or a figure in the church that has been misrepresented by us meaning the church. So I think that is not a matter of spirituality. I think it's a matter of marketing. It's a business matter, you know. And how do we start? We start by really being deliberate and intentional. We haven't created material that is tailored for our young people, you know. And that's our mistake, which we are working on. Because all our materials are 1 fit all. Right? So that's why there's always a miscontextualization, because some facts and some concepts are used on the wrong age group, and they cause harm. And that harm, you know, people grow with it. And also when they qualify to use the same tool, they use it to other people. So it's a cycle of misusing and misrepresentation of the spiritual work of Ellen White. So that's why I'm saying maybe we as a church also, we should ask ourselves, what can we do to put our resources in order to develop material tailored for different levels? Temporary church, for example, temporary. The question would be, what can we do, maybe, to support our children to see Ellen White for who she is, you know, not for who she has become. So that will require us to be deliberate. And be deliberate, you cannot maybe ask Umdete or Dr. Jalika. We need now to ask a 10-year-old to do what we are doing. You know, so that children see that this is not a fairy tale, but it is real. You know, and like social media, we need to follow the metrics, learn what interests them. We cannot say you are just not spiritual. Let's find a way of saying, where is it itchy? How can we help you as a church to scratch? So let's look for an approach that's going to help you, because the mess is there already. So the moment you say you are not spiritual or you don't want to be earnest, we are saying, we are also saying that they hate Ellen White because they are the problem, which is unfair. It's an unfair, look, because they've been made to feel that way. From home, from church. So we need to speed that. It's not going to be instant, but we need to be intentional. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
I think it goes to what the cards that I shared. That's one example. I think in the Sabbath school, we know that we have Bible lessons tailored to age, groups, different age groups. We have classes for them, and they work very well. So we can do the same. That's what the Dr. is saying. We can do the same 4 steps to Christ. Yeah, and we may not have to wait for the general conference to develop such material.
Yes.
We can start it from here. Most of the things we receive from the general conference, actually they come from other divisions. From other conferences that are pioneering. You can start something here which will work very well, which the union who adopted apply elsewhere, and the division and the general conference. Yeah, today we are talking about I will go. It came from South America.
Yes.
So let's not hesitate as we see how we teach the Bible according to age groups. Let's do the same with the spirit of prophecy, as Dr. Mzeti has shared. And we'll find ourselves reaching the children and they will appreciate it.
Yes. No, I appreciate that. Other from this are very pastoral. They are excusing you. I don't want to excuse us too much in in as much as the church has the responsibility, which is the work that we are doing. But I do think it's very important for us also to see where we ourselves may add in the equation,
Take the initiative.
and to take the initiative to see, to study the spirit of prophecy for ourselves and see what we can do while the church is also playing its part. And if we pull our weights from all the various corners, then we'll arrive at a place. I'm actually looking at my question, and we've pretty much touched on all of them, because my next question was going to be around the issue of conflict in interpretation when we find statements whereby it looks like there's contradiction. We touched on that. And then relevance for today, what my sister asked, and then what we first engaged on was speaking to that. And then translation and simplification. Many struggle with Old English style of their books, should be simplified. We touched on that in the morning. And then I was going to lastly ask about if there is a practical example where we can look at a specific quotation maybe that is problematic and use that as an example of how to break down and see how to properly interpret it. But I feel like we've done that. Maybe I'll pause and ask, is there any other question maybe in the crowd? We are still good. All right. I guess we are nearing the end because I'm almost done with my questions.
Yeah, I think when it comes to problematic statements, what can help us is to read broad. Yeah, we may find one statement that we can't understand, but let's read on.
Yes.
Let's read on. We may find somewhere else in her writings where she explains that, or where she makes another statement that makes this one clear. I think we can do the same for the Bible, or we do the same for the Bible. We don't just get stuck with one verse and say, I don't understand the Bible. But by reading broadly, we are able to see how a statement in the Old Testament is clarified by another statement in the New Testament, and so on. However, I don't want to give an impression that we will get to a point where we say, no, everything is clear. No. There will still be certain portions of the writings, just like in the Bible, there may still be portions of the Bible where we still need to continue learning. Some of the Bible passages will become clearer when we have gone through an experience, And when you pass through that experience, then you begin to understand the Bible in a new way.
Yes.
Yeah, in a new way. And so that's why the Bible becomes fresh all the time, because the circumstances in life change. And you find that there is a message for us, a message of comfort, a message of counsel at every stage in our lives, or in whatever circumstances you go through, you find that there is counsel. But when you haven't gone through those situations, some things may mean nothing. Yeah, they may not mean much.
So I think that's very critical, that we And as you rightfully say, for this, that this is applicable to both the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, that you do not want to adopt a mindset that says, I will wait until it all makes sense before I believe, or before I subject, I accept this thing's authority over my life. If there are still some problematic statements, then I'm not going to believe. That is a problematic, a seriously problematic position, or rather a mindset to hold concerning either the Bible or the spirit of prophecy. You must have enough humility as a person to acknowledge the fact that, well, by the way, first of all, I as a person, I have a limit in my ability to understand at any given point in time. And in the fullness of time, when God sees fit, He will assist me to understand. But there is more than enough in that which I understand or can understand for me to have faith that these are counsels that God has sent to us. I think that is very, very critical for us. Oh, wow. Okay. I'll give you 47. Then let me see the hands again. One. So I'll start there at the back. Then yes. You done. Or in fact, let's reverse it. Since you are holding the mic, I'll start with you, Dada, then Ufunis, and then go to Dada there at the back.
Because I want to ask, I'm not sure if it's how I'm going to phrase the question. I think we've already. Being a church that is reaching out into the world, how do I or do we use the mic when we preach to non-Adventists? While there are explanations that come from the spirit of prophecy, that you don't find them clearly in the Bible. It will say that that's not in the Bible. We can act. You see? And then, in that one, why is it for the church edification only? Can we use it if I'm going and quote it verbally or verbatim? How do I keep? If I am invited to preach a Pentecostal church, the church, how do you use it?
I think that's an awesome question. I don't know if you had it for this. How do we use Sister White when we are reaching out, preaching to non-Adventist individuals or non-Adventist individuals or churches who know nothing about Ellen White?
We view Ellen White differently from the way other denominations view her. And as a result, and also her being, outside the biblical canon, may not be seen with the legitimacy, by people who are not Adventists, because they don't have the background, the historical background, and our understanding, biblical understanding of her role as a messenger of God. So herself, she advises that present all your points on the basis of Scripture. That's not a denial of her authority or her inspiration, no. But to be understood, you have to speak on the same terms with the people that you are speaking to. They respect the Bible, you respect the Bible, and so you can present your positions on the basis of that. And Adventism can be communicated to anybody on the basis of the Bible, because we are a Bible-believing denominational church. If you want to witness using, Ellen White, unless if you are just sharing a step to Christ or great controversy, in that case, there is nothing wrong with that. Because when people read their writings, they are linked to the Bible. Yeah, they go to the Bible to verify if what you're saying is in the Bible. And it is through that that you see many coming into our church because of having read her writings. But for you to use her writings as an argument for doctrine, that is a wrong, approach that is not encouraging. Yeah.
Thank you. Then for this.
I think Doc has answered the question very good. I was going to go to 2 points, then I passed the mic. The first one, I think as Adventists also, I'm saying this in a very light note and respectfully. We all know our limitation, or rather say limitations, especially when it comes to the language, the command of language. And sometimes we insist on, there are people who read King James, but really they are good news level people. And there's nothing wrong with reading a simplified version so that you are understood and also you benefit. It's the same thing with Ellen White. People have attitude towards compilations and adaptation. They feel that maybe those books have been watered down, There's some truth that is taken away. But really it's not. It's just topics binded together to make sense of a particular question. Even though it's not a primary book as per category that Doc was explaining earlier, but it's still authored by the same person anyway. And I wanted to move to the last point that we should look forward really to interpretations and using modern tools in how to interpret Ellen White. Like a setup like this is very important because all of us here are not theologians. You've never done homiletics, you've never done hermeneutics, so you don't know how to study an ancient text. You've never been taught on how to interpret a historical text. So as a church, we've made these tools available. There are so many books, literature that's available online for free for you to access so that you can use these modern tools so that you can make sense of Ellen White. For example, the context. Because remember, Ellen White is an American. I'm an African. There is a shift of mindset that I need for me to understand her writings. Also, there's a usage of words that might mean something in the South, in Central America, where here in South Africa it can mean totally different thing. And I might misuse that word to enforce what I want to say and also be out of context. It happens a lot of time. And because I was going to say as well that, remember Ellen White didn't have a PhD. Ellen White was a messenger of the Lord. And there are so many grammatical errors in her writing that we don't see when we read sometimes. Instead, we end up humanizing them and glorifying them. And we always say the way she said this, when it's really grammatically wrong, And we need also to look at those things so that we can make sense of what is the meaning behind the words. Because sometimes, I think in the morning Doc said it, that the words are not inspired. It's the person who's inspired. So the inspiration is thought inspiration. The prophet has spoken. But the wording and how she writes, we have to find a way and also adapt all these methods on how to interpret it and contextualize it so it can be meaningful to us. Whether it was a situational context or it is applicable to the contemporary church, we need also to make an effort so that, because it is here Ellen White who says, a lot of people misuse my work. They choose my work there and put it together to defend their weaknesses. We shouldn't be tempted to do that. but to be attentive, and we can study together as a church in a simplified form. Instead of using big English words, we can just, break it down together so that we understand. We learn with understanding and clarity. Amen. I feel people's eyes in my back.
You have said enough.
Tata, and then Mama over here, and then after that, okay, there's one hand. That will be the last hand. Then I think I'll just give Mufundis if there's any maybe wrapping up of this session. Then we'll take a short break, a song or two, and then we'll go to the last section. Is everyone with me? Amen. Elder.
Thank you for this. Because I like clarity on the council on the cities.
On what?
Moving out of the cities.
Okay, will you allow me to exercise my authority? It's like authority. Our last section is on application of the spirit of prophecy. So this section is an interpretation. So if we can freeze that question, when now we are dealing with the application of the spirit of prophecy, applying it to our lives. Is that okay? All right, it was that. Then
it's the same question.
You really want to leave this city? Just take your bags and go. No, it's fine. We will entertain that question when we are in the last section that is dealing with the application of the spirit of prophecy. Which will be our last hand, and beautiful is for him to wrap us up.
Conflict sometimes happen. The scriptures testify that one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit is prophecy. This gift is an identifying mark of the remnant church, and we believe it was manifested in the ministry of Ellen and White. So this things that I'm trying to say is in one of our fundamental beliefs as Seventh-day Adventists. That is the gift of prophecy. It could have been anyone else. It could be somebody else, not Ellen White. But we believe that God has given this church, this last church, the gift of prophecy. Can it be sometimes in ways abantu babe lokuthalabuza lokungamthathaka isikhathi, they miss the part that this is what we believe in, that God has given us the gift of prophecy. That's where we start. God has given us the gift of prophecy. And what injongo yayo don't also see for us. Maybe that don't you think that it has goes and that I think most people don't understand this belief. One of our fundamental beliefs. If I'm Sabbath, the second coming, Zalosha, this is not the problem. Then maybe I have to look at the belief that God has given us this gift of prophecy through the ministry of Ellen White.
So in other words, the ministry of Ellen White, we believe it's a manifestation of the spirit of prophecy, which is what we believe in as one of our fundamental beliefs. So could it be that the reason why we have this confusion around it is because people don't quite understand that belief? Could that be the issue? I think that is the question. I think we go for this. I think if it was according to the every person who's a baptized member who has an issue with their life, but just send back to the baptism. I'm playing. But I'm playing 50%, but But yes, that is the question. On a serious note, that is the question for this. Could it be that maybe some of the reason why there is confusion is because people haven't quite understood that fundamental belief from the 28 fundamental beliefs?
Thank you very much. I think the fundamental belief number 18 provides a link between Ellen White and the church, in the sense that that fundamental belief is expressing the fact that we acknowledge or we accept the biblical teaching of spiritual gifts. That is, broadly in the New Testament. We understand and believe and accept that the Bible teaches about spiritual gifts. But one of those spiritual gifts is the gift of prophecy. You can find this in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. Among the other spiritual gifts, the gift of prophecy is mentioned there. And looking at Joel chapter 2, verse 28, 29, it talks about in the last days, God will pour His Spirit. And on the day of Pentecost, Peter used that text to explain that phenomenon, what had happened there. But he also indicates that this is not limited to that time, but even to the end of time. So the fulfillment is not complete at the Pentecost and closed, it's also applicable in the last days. And so that fundamental belief really gives a foundation for our accepting Ellen White. She exercised it, or in her ministry, in her life, was manifested one of those spiritual gifts. One of those spiritual gifts, which is the gift of prophecy. Now, in the church, that's not the only spiritual gifting that we acknowledge or we recognize. There are many spiritual gifts. We often, from time to time, do a survey. You know your spiritual gifts. And even though we mentioned the name of Ellen White in that fundamental belief, that is not to say that God will never raise another prophet. Because when Ellen White was still alive, and people were anxious as she was, getting elderly, and say, now, is God going to raise another prophet after you? And her answer was that God had not shown her, had not revealed that to her, whether He will do it or He will not. But she said that if God does not do that, her writings are available, they are sufficient to continue guiding the church until the end of time. And we have the Bible, as the representative studied the sermon, he made reference to her last general conference session she attended, where she said, brothers and sisters, commend to you this way. So that fundamental belief really gives a foundation for our acceptance of Ellen White, as one of the spiritual gifts.
With that said, I think that will be. I think that I'm using. We'll give you the next session. We'll give you next time. I said the last time. We are going to close off this session. We will just take a song or two, and then after that, we will then move over to the next session, which is dealing with application of the spirit of prophecy. We already have one question concerning the counsel from Ellen White about moving out of the city, country living, as we call it, and then I'll also entertain that hand as well. With that being said, I don't know if there's any last thing you would like to say in this segment. You are ready for the break, all right. I hand over to the choristers. Amen. God bless.
Let's take number 326. Number 326.